These days, canon is a big deal. And no, I'm not talking about the big metal cylinders that go boom. Those haven't been a big deal since like pirate times, probably. I'm talking about the idea that for a story, or a franchise of a story, there are certain things that we decide are officially true, and some things that are officially not. The term canon is derived from the Hebrew-Greek word for measuring rod, and it was first adopted by Christians to mean the set definitive rules of the church. It has a couple of different usages in the modern day, such as the idea of the literary canon, but you'll mostly see it used as a way to define which parts of a story are legitimate or not. Of course, that is a little bit silly considering that this is fiction, so technically speaking, none of it is truthful or legitimate, but in the world of modern franchises, the idea of canon is a very important concept. For something like Star Wars or Marvel, where these stories and these characters have been written and rewritten hundreds of times by dozens of different authors, a lot of the times these storylines conflict with each other. Establishing a set canon means picking and choosing which of these storylines you're going to consider when you're doing your future writing, and it really helps avoid confusion. The term also is used nowadays in conversations about The Lord of the Rings. The existence of multiple different movie adaptations, tons of different games, even new TV shows, has left a lot of people wondering what actually counts as canon in a world that just can't seem to stop expanding. Today, I'm going to talk about what is and is not considered canon in The Lord of the Rings, and much more importantly, discuss whether or not that matters at all. By the way, In Deep Geek also did a video covering this topic a couple of months back, and it's super interesting, so I will link that below and go ahead and check that out once you're done here. The idea of canon in fiction is interesting to me because you're looking at fiction, something that is made up, and trying to decide which of these made-up facts is more made up than the other facts. So it does feel a little bit goofy sometimes, but it does have its utility. One article that I read, which is linked in the description with all of my other sources, noted that canon really only becomes important when it comes to corporate ownership of stories. In order for a big franchise like Star Wars to protect its intellectual property, the owners have to decide what that intellectual property is. And as much as they may have wanted to, they can't actually just claim ownership of every idea that everybody has ever had about Star Wars. In order to reboot the franchise, to continue telling the story, they had to disclaim a lot of Star Wars lore, basically only keeping the core 6 movies and the animated shows, and cutting out all of the previous novelizations and spin-offs that had once fleshed out George Lucas's world. They established their canon, and every Disney Star Wars property from then on out has held to that. But that doesn't mean that canon is only useful as a corporate guideline. When you have a story where, for example, a character has 2 different sets of kids, depending on which version of the story you're looking at, if you want to analyze that character, you're gonna have to decide which set of kids you're talking about them having. If you set out beforehand what counts as canon, it can really reduce confusion. However, when it comes to The Lord of the Rings, deciding what is canon and what is not can get a little bit tricky. Sure, you have the main story, the 3 main books, and The Hobbit. But then of course there are different versions of The Hobbit, especially the 1st and 2nd edition have some pretty major differences. Then of course you have the Silmarillion, which a lot of people consider canon. Only the Silmarillion wasn't completely written by Tolkien, and so I would argue that it's not canon. And then there's approximately 1 billion Silmarillion spin-off compendiums, dubiously authored art books out the wazoo, changes made by movies and games, and more fan fiction than I can even conceptualize. So what actually counts as canon? And I will get back to talking about that as soon as I tell you a little bit about this video's sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm, and they're not afraid to go to court and fight for you to get the largest compensation possible. Your serious injury could be worth millions, and Morgan & Morgan are not going to settle for lowball offers from insurance companies. It only takes a few minutes to see if you have a case, you can do it from your smartphone, and unless you win, The process is completely free. Morgan & Morgan has an incredible amount of verdicts, and they've already won back billions for their clients. You can start a claim with America's largest injury law firm in just a click. It's so easy. You can start your claim now with Morgan & Morgan at forthepeople.com/JessoftheShire. Thank you so much to Morgan & Morgan for supporting what I do here and keeping the lights on, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors when I have them. When it comes to establishing what is canon, I find it's easier to start out with what isn't. And right off the bat, I'm just gonna say that none of the adaptations of The Lord of the Rings are canon. Yeah, even the really weird Finnish one where you see every single inch of Gollum's body. For something like Marvel, where they have rebooted this series and they are telling it by film, it's fine for films to be considered canon, but Tolkien's works were always fundamentally and very importantly books. The movie and show adaptations can start their own canon, but they will never be considered true Tolkienian canon. But don't let that discount the importance and the greatness of these adaptations. Films, TV, and video games all have their own unique advantages, whether it be the visual storytelling of cinema, or the episodic structure of television, or the very flexible storytelling of video games. However, these differences mean that they are telling a new story, and not one that can alter the original actual canon. There are, however, a good number of Lord of the Rings books out there. There is this whole genre of Tolkien guidebooks where they pick, one aspect and dive really deeply into it, whether it be Tolkien's characters or his creatures, and most of them are fine. You do have some more dubious authors like David Day, who riff so far off of Tolkien's original ideas that they're just writing fan fiction. And again, there is nothing wrong with fan fiction, whether it be professionally published or simply published online, but the things that are just based off of or spinning off of Tolkien cannot be considered canon. It's best to look at these resources as enjoyable supplemental material, something that lets you explore these ideas a little bit further, rather than looking at them as actual fact within Middle-earth. There's also a whole genre of books and articles that analyze and critique Tolkien. There's even some YouTube videos about it, like mine. This type of writing should also, in my opinion, just be counted as supplementary material. Most people who are writing or talking about Tolkien are going to do their best to present his ideas truthfully, but no matter how much research they do, no matter how accurately they present it, you need to keep in mind that everything has a bias. The moment that you introduce another person into the equation, the moment you take a story off of a page and feed it through somebody else's brain, that story will be altered. So while books and YouTube videos analyzing and retelling Tolkien can be super educational, and you definitely should not unsubscribe from YouTube channels that do that, you should probably keep in mind that these are not more truthful and more canon than the actual books. But then again, not even everything that Tolkien has authored can be considered canon. He published short stories like Farmer Giles of Ham, which takes place in a pseudo-medieval setting with dragons and stuff, but doesn't actually take place in Middle-earth and has no bearings on The Lord of the Rings. And then of course there is The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which was a separately published collection of poems about Tommy B and his aforementioned adventures, as well as all of the other creatures and beasts that live in the Old Forest. This is literally a character that pops up in the Fellowship of the Ring, and he does indeed live in the Old Forest, which is in Middle-earth, so it's sort of canon? But it also contains some creatures that we never see anywhere else in Middle-earth, so if it is canon, it's kind of irrelevant. Even The Hobbit, which is very well known and established as part of the Lord of the Rings canon, isn't totally set in stone. You see, The Hobbit was not originally conceived of as a prequel for The Lord of the Rings, with all of its darkness and complex plot lines and lore. It was a children's fairy tale, almost entirely not connected to the larger legendarium that Tolkien had been working on for most of his life. It was only when publishers began demanding a sequel to The Hobbit, and Tolkien started work on what would become The Lord of the Rings, that he realized that he had written himself into a bit of a corner. The original Hobbit, published in 1937, included the scene with Bilbo and Gollum and the riddles in the dark, but it played out much differently. At the end of the game, Gollum just offers the ring to Bilbo as a prize, Bilbo takes it, and then Gollum guides him out of the caves himself. The ring is just a magical ring of invisibility, with no darker implications. Of course, as The Lord of the Rings grew in scope, Tolkien realized that that ring wasn't just some trinket. He had to go back and rewrite that scene to become the one that we all know today, with Bilbo finding Gollum's precious ring and barely escaping with his life. As for how to justify this change in the second edition, Tolkien had two options. Either the first must be regarded as washed out, a mere miswriting that ought never to have seen the light, or the story as a whole must take into account the existence of two versions and use it. Basically, his options were to put out a second version of The Hobbit and put in a note in the beginning that just said, "Whoops, I wrote that scene wrong last time," or to find in-story justification for it. Because Tolkien was Tolkien, of course he chose the second and more complicated route. To understand his logic, we first need to remember that Tolkien frames The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit as an ancient found text that he has discovered and translated into the version that we know. Within this internal logic, then, the first edition of The Hobbit, with its inconsequential ring, was the story as Bilbo told it. He was completely unaware of the true nature of the ring, and so in order to make the tale better suited to children, Bilbo swept all of the nastiness about Gollum under the rug, and thus we have the historical account of The Hobbit as Bilbo first told it. Thus, when Bilbo recounts his dealings with Gollum at the Council of Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring, that is him telling these people the true story for the first time, that Gollum had an unhealthy obsession with the ring, and Bilbo was almost killed stealing it. The second edition of The Hobbit, which has been fixed to have the canon-accurate account of the events, was put in by Frodo, who is going back to correct it. Tolkien, as the supposed modern translator of this real story, put these changes into the second edition of The Hobbit to reflect the canonical reality. I'll tell you what, if you take a drink every time I'm using air quotes in this video, then you are going to be telling some funny stories about Gollum too. So even from the earliest days of the Legendarium, even from Tolkien's own hand, we can see that the concept of canon is a little bit fluid. This only becomes more true in the case of one of Tolkien's most infamous works, the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is looked at as the Bible of Middle-earth. It's basically a history textbook, covering everything from the creation story of Arda, the first waking of the elves, and the forging of the Great Rings. Also, and in my opinion most importantly, it was unfinished. His son Christopher was left after his death with a pile of notes and a desire to someday, somehow, see his father's great work be published. In the foreword to the Silmarillion, Christopher Tolkien explains that it was far indeed from being a fixed text, and did not remain unchanged even in certain fundamental ideas concerning the nature of the world it portrays. As the years passed, the changes and variants, both in detail and in larger perspectives, became so complex, so pervasive, and so many-layered that a final and definitive version seemed unattainable. In order to get the Silmarillion, Christopher Tolkien, with the help of author Guy Gavriel Kay, had to do some serious work. They compiled, edited, cross-referenced, picked and chose, and in some cases wrote entire chapters on their own in order to get a version of the Silmarillion that was publishable. In my opinion, the extent of the editing and rewriting that was required in order to get the version of this that we have today means that the Silmarillion isn't really canon. Don't get me wrong, it's probably the best interpretation of Tolkien's Legendarium that we are ever gonna get, and I very much like it. But in terms of true canon, of firmly decided facts within Tolkien's universe, I think there was just too much left unfinished. But this whole conversation really makes me wonder whether or not the Silmarillion was ever destined to be finished at all. Whether it was possible for it ever to actually become canon. It is, by far, the oldest, the earliest version of Middle-earth lore that Tolkien came up with. Bits and pieces of the Legendarium can be traced all the way back to 1916, back in the trenches of the First World War. But it became a lifelong labor of love, quite frankly, because it's hard to write something that seems like real history. Tolkien admitted it is astonishingly difficult to avoid mistakes and changes of name and all kinds of inconsistencies of detail in a long work. His Middle-earth mythos was a constantly evolving web of characters, languages, and stories. Though he was committed to ironing out as many of these details as he could, every change he made, every fix he made caused a butterfly effect of other fixes that needed to be made. The Silmarillion was never a set story. It continued to evolve and change long after The Lord of the Rings had become a fantasy classic. But by 1971, Tolkien wrote to his publishers and told them to be ready for a fully finished copy of the Silmarillion by the end of the year. He was confident that by then it would be done. However, just a few months later after making that report, his wife Edith passed away, and that seemed to take the wind out of his sails instantly. In a span of a few months, he went from saying that the Silmarillion was almost done to telling fans, "I am an old man struggling to finish some of his work. Every extra task, however small, diminishes my chance of ever publishing the Silmarillion." In August of 1973, he wrote to his friend Lord Halsbury, "When you retire, I shall certainly beg your help. Without it, I begin to feel that I shall never produce any part of the Silmarillion. When you were here, I became again vividly aware of your invigorating effect on me, like a warm fire brought into an old man's room. May I hope that perhaps, even amid your own trials and the heavy work which must precede your retirement, you could come again before so very long and warm me up again?" Tolkien died less than a month later, and the Silmarillion remained incomplete. And as tragic as that is, I think there is a reason for it. Throughout his life, Tolkien was plagued by a very particular sort of perfectionism. His standards for how to tell a fantasy story the right way meant that oftentimes his own stories would not meet his own standards. He worked and he reworked. He wrote and he rewrote, and honestly, it's kind of a miracle he ever published anything at all. And Tolkien addresses this struggle in his short story, Leaf by Niggle. This short story was written shortly after the publication of The Hobbit, when publishers were first starting to get on him about producing a sequel, and you can really feel the tension that he was under. I did do a full video reading this story this time last year, so I'll link that in the description if you want to check that out, but it tells the story of a painter named Niggle. He is, unsurprisingly, very similar to Tolkien in his creative process. He was the sort of painter who can paint leaves better than trees. He used to spend a long time on a single leaf, trying to catch its shape, its sheen, and the glistening of dewdrops on its edges. Yet he wanted to paint a whole tree, with all of its leaves in the same style and all of them different. Niggle is working on his masterpiece day and night, trying desperately to finish it before he must leave on an unspecified journey. However, this painting just won't seem to stop growing. How can you say that it's done when it still needs just another leaf here or a mountain in the background there? And he is plagued by interruptions as he tries to finish his work. He has an annoying neighbor who constantly needs his help. He has people wanting to stop in for tea. He has government business that he has to take care of. The whole world seems to conspire against Niggle ever completing his great piece of work. He's trying to repair his neighbor's roof after a storm when time runs out. "There now," said the inspector. "You'll have to go, but it's a bad way to start on your journey, leaving your jobs undone. Still, we can at least make some use of this canvas now." "Oh dear," said poor Niggle, beginning to weep, "and it's not even finished." "Not finished," said the driver. "Well, it's finished with, as far as you're concerned at any rate." They're going to tear his painting apart to use the canvas of it to fix his neighbor's roof, and Niggle is dragged off without even being given the time to pack a bag. He's sent to a purgatory-like work camp, where his creative energy is leached away by labor and pain. Eventually, when he is too beaten down to even stand, a merciful voice comes along and decides it's time for him to receive a bit of gentle treatment. The place that they bring Niggle seems awfully familiar, and he quickly realizes that he has been brought to the world of his painting. He went on looking at the tree. All the leaves he had ever labored at were there, as he had imagined them, rather than as he had made them, and there were others that had only budded in his mind, and many that might have budded, if only he had had time. In this paradise, with the help of his once curmudgeonly neighbor, Niggle finishes his great masterpiece to his complete and utter satisfaction, and is allowed to retire into the distant mountains at the back of the painting. In the real world, all that's left of the painting is a corner, the painting of a single leaf, which makes its way to the local museum. Upon seeing this leaf, one of his acquaintances observes, "I never knew he painted." That was probably the last time Niggle's name ever came up in conversation. However, Atkins preserved the odd corner. Most of it crumbled, but one beautiful leaf remained intact. Atkins had it framed. Later, he left it to the town museum, and for a long while, Leaf by Niggle hung there in a recess and was noticed by a few eyes. But eventually the museum was burnt down, and the leaf and Niggle were entirely forgotten in his old country. This story is a clear allegory, or if you don't like the term allegory, a clear reflection of the life of a perfectionistic artist. It acknowledges that nothing can truly be done unless its creator decides that it is finished, and that life does an awfully good job of getting in the way. Although Tolkien wrote this short story long before he was ever trying to finish the Silmarillion, we can see his frustrations, his struggles, echoed in Niggle's tribulations. And just like Niggle, Tolkien was taken away for his great journey before ever getting to complete his masterpiece. However, we know from Leaf by Niggle that Tolkien did not see death as the end. It lets us hope that wherever Tolkien ended up, he now has all the time in the world to complete his great story. The whole concept of canon, of a strict definition of a story's facts, was kind of antithetical to everything that Tolkien was trying to do. In his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien explains that he sees stories as all massed together and bubbling in a giant cauldron. The greater human consciousness takes tales, history, and folklore, breaks them up into bits and pieces, and tosses them into the pot to bubble and boil and mingle. Every new story is made up by pieces of the old, chosen and transformed by each cook who serves it. Tolkien explained that fairy stories are by no means rocky matrices out of which the fossils cannot be prized except by an expert geologist. The ancient elements can be knocked out, or forgotten and dropped out, or replaced by other ingredients with the greatest ease. In a way, the Silmarillion could never be finished to Tolkien's complete satisfaction, because that's not the way that real history, that real story, works. There's never one set, decided-on version of history. There is no canon to real life. Besides, if you were to explain and explore every part of a world in excruciating detail, you jeopardize the magic that fantasy is capable of. In 1963, Tolkien admitted that he was a bit worried about whether it was a great idea to finish and publish the Silmarillion at all. Part of the attraction of The Lord of the Rings is, I think, due to the glimpses of a larger history in the background. An attraction like that of viewing far off an unvisited island, or seeing the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist. To go there is to destroy the magic unless new unattainable vistas are again revealed. There is a magic in not knowing, in not having a canon. For Tolkien to rigidly define what was real and unreal, to know the entire world, would drain it of its magic. There were mysteries, there were contradictions, there were blatant unknowns, and that's what made it so special. Canon is important. It is a tool, and if we're gonna be dogmatic about it, if you want me to get specific, I would say that the only true canon is The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but honestly, that doesn't really matter in most conversations. As soon as Tolkien dreamed up Middle-earth, with its beautiful, wide seas, its magical rings, its far-off, sparkling kingdoms, it entered the great cauldron of story, and will never be the same, destined, just like Niggle's masterpiece, to remain beautifully unfinished. This was a video idea from one of my patrons on Discord. So if you have any great video ideas and you want to, do my job for me and give them to me, you can go ahead and check that out. The link is in the description. I do think it's kind of interesting how we come up with these modern notions of a story having a canon, and then we go in and kind of try to retrofit these older stories into the modern idea of canon when they weren't ever really made to have anything be that clear. I think it's important to remember that the modern way of looking at stories is not always the way that stories were looked at. And by taking ourselves a bit lightly and being willing to acknowledge that there are other ways of telling stories than the way we tell them, we might get a lot more out of them. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it or you learned something, and if you want to join me here every single week to discuss storytelling, The Lord of the Rings, and any other literature I like, feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.